The Pacific Northwest coast extends from northern California through British Columbia into southern Alaska, encompassing a narrow strip between the Pacific Ocean and the Cascade and Coast Mountain ranges. This region supported some of the densest prehistoric populations north of Mexico, sustained by exceptional marine and riverine resources. The archaeological record reveals adaptations spanning more than 10,000 years, though coastal site preservation remains incomplete due to sea level changes and erosion. Understanding this region requires examining how environmental abundance shaped human societies differently than in most other North American contexts. The material evidence indicates trajectories toward sedentism, resource intensification, and social hierarchy that developed without reliance on agriculture. The Pacific Northwest coast occupies a geographically narrow but ecologically diverse zone. The region stretches approximately 1,500 miles along the Pacific margin. Mountain ranges rise directly from the ocean in many areas, creating steep topography with limited coastal plains. The Cascade Range and Coast Mountains form the eastern boundary, blocking continental air masses and creating sharp climatic contrasts between coast and interior. Glaciation shaped the landscape extensively during the Pleistocene. Ice sheets covered most of the northern portion of the region until approximately 15,000 years ago. Glacial retreat left behind complex fjord systems, islands, and deeply incised river valleys. Sea levels fluctuated dramatically during deglaciation. The coastline stood as much as 100 meters lower than present levels during the last glacial maximum. Rising seas submerged extensive portions of the continental shelf, eliminating early coastal sites from the archaeological record. The climate varies considerably across latitude and elevation. The southern portions receive moderate rainfall year-round with mild winters. Northern areas experience heavier precipitation and colder temperatures. Maritime influence moderates seasonal temperature extremes throughout the coastal zone. Prevailing westerly winds bring moisture-laden air from the Pacific. This moisture falls as heavy precipitation when air masses encounter coastal mountains. Annual rainfall exceeds 200 centimeters in some areas. The rain shadow effect produces drier conditions immediately inland from the mountain crests. Rivers drain the coastal mountains in short, steep courses. The Columbia River represents the major exception, draining a vast interior basin before reaching the Pacific. Smaller rivers including the Fraser, Skeena, and Nass carry substantial volumes despite their limited drainage areas. These waterways provided critical transportation routes and supported anadromous fish populations. Salmon runs constituted the most significant resource concentration in the region. 5 Pacific salmon species migrate from the ocean into freshwater systems to spawn. Salmon runs occurred predictably each year, providing concentrated protein sources during specific seasons. Rivers also supported populations of eulachon, sturgeon, and steelhead trout. The coastline itself consists of rocky headlands, gravel beaches, protected bays, and extensive island systems. The Strait of Georgia, Puget Sound, and the Inside Passage create sheltered marine environments. These protected waters contain abundant shellfish beds, marine mammals, and fish populations. Open ocean access allowed exploitation of pelagic resources, including halibut and marine mammals. The intertidal zone supported extensive shellfish harvesting. Clams, mussels, oysters, and other mollusks concentrated in accessible locations. These resources required minimal technology to exploit and provided reliable food sources during most seasons. Terrestrial environments varied by elevation and latitude. Temperate rainforests dominated lower elevations along the coast. These forests consisted primarily of western red cedar, Douglas fir, Sitka spruce, and western hemlock. Forest resources included not only timber, but also edible plants, medicinal species, and materials for technology. Cedar provided wood for houses, canoes, and carved objects. Its bark served as raw material for clothing, baskets, and rope. The forest understory produced berries, roots, and other plant foods. Salal berries, salmon berries, huckleberries, and blackberries ripened at different seasons. Root crops, including camas and wapato, grew in meadows and wetland margins. Alpine and subalpine zones existed at higher elevations. These areas supported different plant communities and attracted terrestrial mammals during summer months. Mountain goats inhabited steep terrain above the tree line. Black-tailed deer and Roosevelt elk range through lower elevation forests and meadows. These mammals provided meat, hides, bone, and antler for various purposes. Bear populations exploited seasonal resources, including salmon runs and berry patches. Marine mammals constituted another significant resource category. Harbor seals, sea lions, sea otters, and porpoises inhabited coastal waters. Larger whales migrated through offshore waters seasonally. The environmental diversity created multiple ecological zones within short distances. Groups could access marine, riverine, forest, and upland resources without extensive travel. This proximity of varied resources distinguished the Pacific Northwest coast from most other regions. The concentration and predictability of key resources, particularly salmon and shellfish, allowed different patterns of settlement and social organization than those typical of hunter-gatherer societies elsewhere. The landscape supported higher population densities than environments dependent on more dispersed or less predictable resources. Environmental conditions also created preservation biases in the archaeological record. Acidic forest soils decompose organic materials rapidly. Bone, wood, fiber, and other perishable items rarely survive, except in unusual depositional contexts. Shell middens provide alkaline conditions that preserve bone, and sometimes other materials. Waterlogged sites occasionally preserve wooden artifacts and organic remains. Most archaeological evidence consists of stone tools, fire-altered rock, and shell deposits. This preservation pattern limits understanding of technologies that relied primarily on organic materials. The coastal configuration changed substantially as sea levels rose following deglaciation. The current coastline stabilized approximately 5,000 years ago in most areas. Earlier coastal occupations now lie submerged on the continental shelf. This submergence creates a significant gap in the coastal archaeological record. Sites dating before 5,000 years ago occur primarily in areas that were inland during periods of lower sea level, or in locations where tectonic uplift raised ancient shorelines above current sea level. The loss of early coastal sites makes reconstruction of initial human adaptations to the coastal environment difficult. Volcanic activity affected portions of the region periodically. Mount Mazama erupted approximately 7,700 years ago, depositing volcanic ash across a wide area. This ash layer provides a useful chronological marker in archaeological and geological deposits. Other volcanic events occurred less dramatically, but still influenced local environments. Earthquakes and tsunamis impacted coastal areas episodically. Tectonic activity continues in this geologically active zone. The Pacific Northwest coast environment provided exceptional resource abundance compared to most regions occupied by prehistoric hunter-gatherers. This abundance derived from the combination of productive marine ecosystems, predictable anadromous fish runs, extensive shellfish beds, and diverse terrestrial resources. The environmental foundation shaped subsequent human adaptations in distinctive ways. Understanding how groups exploited and managed these resources requires examining the archaeological evidence for settlement patterns, subsistence strategies, and technological developments across thousands of years of occupation. The earliest secure evidence for human presence in the Pacific Northwest coast region dates to the terminal Pleistocene and early Holocene periods. Archaeological sites from this interval remain relatively scarce. Coastal submergence eliminated many potential early sites. Interior locations preserve limited evidence of initial occupation. The archaeological record improves substantially only after approximately 9,000 years ago. Debates continue regarding the timing and routes of initial human entry into the region. Researchers propose both coastal and interior migration pathways. The available evidence does not definitively resolve these questions. No confirmed pre-Clovis sites exist in the Pacific Northwest coast region. Claims for earlier occupations lack widespread acceptance among archaeologists. The oldest widely accepted evidence consists of Clovis age and Western stem tradition artifacts dating between 13,000 and 11,000 years ago. These materials occur primarily in interior settings rather than coastal contexts. The absence of coastal sites from this period reflects preservation issues rather than necessarily indicating absence of coastal occupation. Submerged shorelines prevent direct investigation of potential early coastal settlements. Clovis culture artifacts appear rarely in the Pacific Northwest coast region compared to other parts of North America. A few isolated fluted points have been recovered from surface contexts and disturbed deposits. The scarcity may reflect limited Clovis population presence or poor preservation of sites from this period. Clovis groups elsewhere focused heavily on hunting large mammals. The Pacific Northwest environment offered different resource structures that may have attracted different adaptations. Whether Clovis populations entered the coastal region remains uncertain based on current evidence. Western stemmed tradition artifacts occur more frequently than Clovis materials in the region. These stemmed projectile points date to roughly the same time period as Clovis, but represent a different technological tradition. Western stemmed points appear in interior plateau regions and occasionally in coastal areas. The relationship between Clovis and Western stemmed traditions remains debated. Some researchers argue they represent distinct populations. Others suggest they reflect different functional toolkits used by the same groups. The limited sample size prevents definitive conclusions. Several sites provide evidence for human presence during the terminal Pleistocene. On the northern Channel Islands off California, Arlington Springs Man dates to approximately 13,000 years ago. This burial indicates coastal occupation and maritime capability at an early date. The presence of human remains on an island requires boat technology. Similar early coastal evidence from the Pacific Northwest proper remains lacking. Sea level rise submerged most areas that would have been coastline during this period. The Manus Mastodon site in western Washington provides rare evidence of human interaction with Pleistocene megafauna. Excavators recovered a mastodon skeleton with a bone projectile point embedded in a rib. Dating places the remains at approximately 14,000 years ago. This find demonstrates human presence in the western Washington area during the terminal Pleistocene. The use of bone rather than stone for the projectile point suggests adaptations to local material availability. Similar finds remain extremely rare in the coastal region. Interior sites preserve more terminal Pleistocene evidence than coastal locations. The Paisley Caves in south-central Oregon contain deposits dating to approximately 14,000 years ago. These caves lie in the Great Basin but connect to coastal regions through the Columbia River drainage. Human coprolites from Paisley Caves provide direct evidence of human presence. DNA analysis confirms human origin of the specimens. The caves demonstrate that people occupied areas peripheral to the coastal zone during the terminal Pleistocene. Cooper's Ferry in western Idaho preserves an occupation dating to approximately 16,000 years ago. This site lies along the Salmon River, which connects to the Columbia River system. Excavators recovered stone tools from stratigraphic contexts with secure dates. The artifact assemblage differs from Clovis technology. Some researchers interpret Cooper's Ferry as evidence for a coastal migration route into the Americas. Others remain skeptical of this interpretation. The site nonetheless demonstrates human presence in the Columbia River drainage area during the late Pleistocene. Coastal site distribution reflects preservation and discovery biases. Areas that experienced tectonic uplift preserve raised beaches from earlier periods. These locations provide windows into ancient coastal occupations. The Queen Charlotte Islands, now called Haida Gwaii, contain several important early sites. Kilgai Gwaii on the islands preserves evidence of coastal occupation dating to approximately 10,000 years ago. Excavators recovered stone tools and faunal remains indicating marine resource use. The site demonstrates established coastal adaptation by the early Holocene. Richardson Island in Haida Gwaii contains deposits dating back approximately 10,000 years. The site preserves evidence of marine mammal hunting and fishing. Stone tool assemblages include microblades, a technology associated with northern traditions. The presence of microblades suggests connections to populations from Alaska and northeastern Asia. Archaeological evidence indicates that coastal groups maintained maritime technologies and focused on ocean resources from early periods. The Namu site on the central British Columbia coast contains one of the longest occupation sequences in the region. Initial occupation dates to approximately 10,000 years ago. The site preserves shell-midden deposits, stone tools, and faunal remains spanning millennia. Early levels contain evidence for salmon fishing, shellfish gathering, and marine mammal hunting. The long sequence at Namu allows researchers to track changes in subsistence practices and technology over time. Chuck Lake on Heceta Island in southeastern Alaska preserves evidence of coastal occupation dating to approximately 10,000 years ago. The site contains stone tools and worked bone implements. Faunal remains indicate exploitation of marine and terrestrial resources. The presence of worked bone tools suggests sophisticated organic technology that rarely preserves in the archaeological record. Chuck Lake demonstrates that coastal adaptations extended into southeastern Alaska by the early Holocene. South of the Canadian border, early coastal sites remain scarce. The Puget Sound region and outer Washington coast lack well-dated early Holocene sites. This absence likely reflects sea level changes and coastal erosion rather than lack of occupation. Interior river valleys preserve more evidence from this period. Sites along the Columbia River and its tributaries contain deposits dating to the early Holocene. These locations provided access to salmon runs and served as pathways between coast and interior. The scarcity of early sites creates interpretive challenges. Archaeologists cannot determine population sizes or settlement densities from the limited evidence. Whether initial coastal populations were small or whether preservation simply obscures a more substantial presence remains unknown. The available sites demonstrate that people occupied coastal environments and exploited marine resources by at least 10,000 years ago. The specific origins of these populations and their relationships to interior groups remain subjects of ongoing research and debate. Stone tool technologies from early sites show variability across the region. Some assemblages contain microblades and microblade cores. Others include leaf-shaped points and stemmed points. Technological diversity may reflect different populations, different functional needs, or chronological changes. Establishing clear technological sequences remains difficult given the limited sample of early sites. Researchers continue to develop regional chronologies as new sites are discovered and dated. The early archaeological record demonstrates that human groups adapted successfully to Pacific Northwest coast environments by the terminal Pleistocene and early Holocene. These adaptations included maritime technologies, fishing capabilities, and exploitation of diverse coastal resources. The foundations for subsequent coastal cultures were established during this early period. Understanding the details of these initial adaptations requires discovery of additional sites, particularly from now submerged coastal contexts. Current evidence provides only a fragmentary view of the earliest human occupation of the Pacific Northwest coast. Environmental changes following the last glacial maximum profoundly affected human settlement in the Pacific Northwest coast region. Deglaciation began approximately 18,000 years ago. Ice sheets retreated northward over several millennia. The Cordilleran ice sheet covered most of British Columbia and extended into northern Washington during maximum glaciation. As ice melted, new lands became available for human occupation. Sea levels rose simultaneously as meltwater returned to the oceans. These dual processes of ice retreat and sea level rise created dynamic coastal environments. The Cordilleran ice sheet fragmented into separate ice masses during retreat. Some areas became ice-free earlier than others. Coastal regions of southeastern Alaska and British Columbia deglaciated between 16,000 and 13,000 years ago. The timing varied by location depending on local ice dynamics and topography. The Fraser River Valley remained ice-covered until approximately 11,000 years ago. Puget Sound deglaciated around 14,000 years ago. As ice retreated, barren landscapes gradually supported vegetation colonization. Plant communities changed substantially during the transition from glacial to interglacial conditions. Initially, tundra and parkland vegetation occupied newly deglaciated areas. Spruce and pine forests expanded as climates warmed. By approximately 10,000 years ago, modern forest compositions began establishing themselves. Western hemlock, western red cedar, and Douglas fir became dominant species in coastal forests. The establishment of productive forest ecosystems created habitat for terrestrial mammals and supported human populations through provision of plant foods and raw materials. Sea level rise proceeded episodically rather than uniformly. Global sea levels stood approximately 120 meters below present during the last glacial maximum. Meltwater pulses caused rapid rises during certain intervals. By approximately 5,000 years ago, sea levels approached modern positions in most areas. The rising seas transformed coastal geography dramatically. River valleys flooded to create fjords and inlets. Hills became islands. Extensive lowland areas disappeared beneath the ocean. The continental shelf that had been exposed as dry land during glacial periods submerged completely. The relationship between ice retreat and sea level rise created complex patterns. In some areas, isostatic rebound occurred as ice weight diminished. Land surfaces rose as the crust adjusted to reduced glacial loading. This rebound process sometimes outpaced sea level rise, causing relative sea level fall in certain locations. Other areas experienced net submergence as global sea level rise exceeded local uplift. These varied patterns mean that ancient shorelines occur at different elevations relative to modern sea level, depending on location. Some former beaches now stand above current sea level, while others lie submerged. Early Holocene climates warmed substantially compared to glacial conditions. The period between approximately 11,000 and 8,000 years ago saw rapid environmental changes. Temperatures increased. Precipitation patterns shifted. These changes affected resource availability and distribution. Salmon populations established themselves in rivers as ice dams broke and spawning habitat became accessible. Marine ecosystems adjusted to changing ocean temperatures and currents. Shellfish beds developed in newly formed intertidal zones. Human groups adapted their settlement patterns in response to environmental changes. Early Holocene sites cluster in specific environmental settings. Locations near salmon-bearing streams show evidence of repeated occupation. Shell middens begin appearing in the archaeological record around 10,000 years ago. These accumulations of discarded mollusk shells indicate intensive shellfish harvesting. The earliest middens tend to be small and dispersed. Over time, middens increase in size and density, suggesting intensification of shellfish exploitation. The distribution of early Holocene sites indicates high residential mobility. Groups moved seasonally to exploit different resources. Winter settlements likely occurred in protected locations with stored food supplies. Spring and summer camps dispersed across the landscape to access diverse resources. Salmon runs attracted aggregations during late summer and fall. This pattern of seasonal mobility characterized early coastal adaptations. Residential bases shifted locations rather than remaining permanently occupied. Stone tool assemblages from early Holocene sites reflect varied activities. Projectile points indicate hunting of terrestrial and marine mammals. Cutting and scraping tools suggest hide processing and woodworking. Ground stone implements appear in some early contexts. These tools include simple abraders and grinding slabs. The presence of grinding tools indicates processing of plant foods or other materials requiring pulverization. Technology emphasized expedient tool production using locally available stone materials. Microblade technology appears in some northern coastal sites during the early Holocene. Microblades are small, parallel-sided stone flakes struck from prepared cores. These flakes were hafted into bone or wood handles to create composite tools. Microblade technology relates to traditions from Alaska and northeastern Asia. The presence of microblades in coastal British Columbia and southeastern Alaska suggests population connections to northern regions. Southern areas lack microblade technology, indicating different cultural traditions or population origins. Cobble tool traditions characterize many early coastal assemblages. These implements consist of minimally modified cobbles used for chopping, pounding, and other heavy-duty tasks. Large cobbles served as cores for flake production. Smaller cobbles functioned as hammerstones. The emphasis on cobble tools reflects exploitation of coastal geology, where rounded stones occurred abundantly on beaches. Cobble tools remained common throughout the coastal sequence despite other technological changes. Faunal remains from early Holocene sites demonstrate broad-spectrum resource use. Marine mammals, including seals and sea lions, appear in deposits dating to 10,000 years ago. Fish bones indicate exploitation of salmon, halibut, and other species. Shellfish remains dominate many sites by volume. Land mammals, including deer and elk, also contributed to diets. Bird bones occur occasionally. This diversity suggests that groups exploited all available resource types rather than specializing narrowly. The early appearance of salmon fishing holds particular significance. Salmon bones from sites like Namu and Richardson Island demonstrate that anadromous fish exploitation began by 10,000 years ago. Harvesting salmon runs requires specific technologies, including fishing weirs, nets, spears, and drying racks. The archaeological evidence indicates these technologies existed by the early Holocene, even though the organic components rarely preserve. Salmon dependence became increasingly important over subsequent millennia. Settlement patterns gradually shifted toward greater sedentism during the Middle Holocene. This period spans approximately 8,000 to 4,000 years ago. Sites from this interval show evidence of longer occupations and larger accumulations of cultural materials. Shell middens grow substantially in size. Some locations show evidence of house structures. The transition from high mobility to more sedentary patterns occurred gradually rather than abruptly. Different areas show this shift at different times. Population levels likely increased during the Middle Holocene. More sites from this period exist in the archaeological record than from earlier intervals. This increase may partly reflect better preservation of more recent sites. However, the pattern likely also indicates genuine population growth. Larger populations could be supported as groups developed more intensive resource extraction techniques and storage technologies. The predictability and abundance of coastal resources permitted population densities higher than those sustainable in most hunter-gatherer contexts. Climate fluctuations during the Holocene affected resource availability. A warm, dry period occurred between approximately 8,000 and 5,000 years ago in some areas. This interval, sometimes called the hypsothermal or altithermal, saw reduced effective moisture. River flows may have declined. Forest fire frequency increased. These conditions potentially stressed salmon populations in some watersheds. Archaeological evidence suggests some coastal sites were abandoned or used less intensively during portions of this interval. Cooling and increased moisture began approximately 5,000 years ago. This shift toward cooler, wetter conditions created environments more similar to the present. Salmon populations likely expanded as stream flows increased. Forest productivity may have increased with greater moisture availability. Archaeological sites become more numerous and larger after this climatic shift. The improved conditions supported continued population growth and cultural elaboration. The post-glacial period established the environmental and cultural foundations for subsequent developments in the Pacific Northwest coast region. Ice retreat opened new territories. Sea level rise created the modern coastline configuration. Forests developed to provide timber and plant resources. Marine ecosystems matured to support diverse fish and mammal populations. Human groups adapted increasingly successful strategies for exploiting coastal resources. Settlement patterns evolved from high mobility toward greater sedentism. Population levels increased as resource extraction intensified. These early and middle Holocene developments set trajectories that culminated in the complex societies documented in the late prehistoric period. Marine resources formed the economic foundation for Pacific Northwest coast societies throughout prehistory. The ocean, rivers, and intertidal zones provided protein sources that supported dense populations. Exploitation of these resources required specialized knowledge, technologies, and labor organization. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that marine-focused subsistence developed early and intensified over time. The predictability and abundance of key resources distinguished the Pacific Northwest coast from most other regions occupied by hunter-gatherer populations. Salmon constituted the single most important resource for most coastal groups. 5 Pacific salmon species spawn in regional rivers. Chinook, coho, sockeye, chum, and pink salmon migrate from the ocean into freshwater at different times. Run timing varies by species, river system, and geographic location. This variation created extended harvesting seasons. Groups positioned themselves strategically to intercept salmon runs. Rivers with large, predictable runs attracted permanent or semi-permanent settlements. Smaller streams supported seasonal camps. Salmon fishing required substantial technological investment. Nets, weirs, traps, spears, and hooks all served to capture fish. Most of this equipment utilized organic materials that rarely preserve archaeologically. Wooden weir stakes occasionally survive in waterlogged contexts. These finds demonstrate engineering sophistication. Weirs consisted of wooden stakes driven into stream beds to create barriers or channels. Fish entering these structures could be trapped or speared. Construction and maintenance of weirs required coordinated labor. Some weir systems extended across entire river channels. Net fishing allowed capture of large numbers of salmon efficiently. Nets were manufactured from plant fibers or animal sinew. Dip nets, gill nets, and seine nets served different purposes. Archaeological evidence for nets consists primarily of stone net weights. These perforated or notched stones anchored nets in position. Net weights occur abundantly at sites near productive fishing locations. The distribution and frequency of net weights indicate the importance of net fishing throughout the coastal sequence. Processing salmon for storage required intensive labor. Fresh salmon spoil rapidly. Groups developed techniques to preserve fish through drying and smoking. Fish were split, cleaned, and hung on wooden racks. Smoke from fires beneath the racks preserved the flesh and deterred insects. Properly dried salmon could be stored for months. Storage capacity determined how many people could be supported through winter when fresh food availability declined. The development of effective storage technology enabled population concentration and sedentism. Shellfish provided another critical protein source. Clams, mussels, oysters, cockles, and other bivalves occurred in dense beds along shorelines. Harvesting shellfish required minimal technology. Digging sticks sufficed to extract most species. Shellfish gathering could be conducted by individuals of any age or physical capability. This accessibility made shellfish an important, reliable resource. Tidal cycles determined harvesting schedules. Low tides exposed intertidal beds for collection. Shell middens constitute the most visible archaeological feature at many coastal sites. These deposits consist of accumulated shell refuse from centuries or millennia of shellfish consumption. Some middens extend for hundreds of meters along shorelines. Depths reach several meters at intensively occupied locations. Midden formation rates varied depending on intensity of occupation and harvesting practices. Rapid accumulation indicates intensive shellfish exploitation. Slow accumulation suggests intermittent use or lower population densities. Analysis of shell midden composition provides insights into harvesting patterns. Different shellfish species prefer different environmental conditions. Changes in species composition over time indicate environmental changes or shifts in harvesting strategies. Clam sizes decrease in some midden sequences, suggesting overexploitation of local beds. Groups responded to resource depression by expanding harvesting territories or shifting to other resources. The resilience of shellfish populations allowed sustained exploitation despite intensive harvesting. Marine mammals contributed significantly to coastal economies. Harbor seals and sea lions congregated at haul-out sites and rookeries. These aggregations provided predictable hunting opportunities. Hunters used harpoons to capture seals and sea lions. Harpoon technology consisted of detachable heads connected to lines. The struck animal tired as it pulled against the line. Hunters then dispatched the animal with clubs or spears. Marine mammal hunting required boats and specialized equipment. Sea otters formerly ranged throughout the coastal region in large numbers. These animals were hunted for meat and pelts. Sea otter bones appear in archaeological sites along the outer coast. Porpoises and small whales also contributed to subsistence. Larger whales were occasionally hunted by specialized groups in certain areas. Whaling required exceptional maritime skill and technology. Evidence for deliberate whale hunting remains limited to specific regions and time periods. More commonly, groups scavenged beached whales that died naturally or became stranded. Fishing for non-anadromous species supplemented salmon harvesting. Halibut, lingcod, rockfish, and other species inhabited near-shore and offshore waters. Hook and line fishing captured these species. Composite fish hooks consisted of wooden shanks and bone or shell points. The design of hooks varied by target species and fishing method. Halibut hooks incorporated specialized features to catch bottom-dwelling flatfish. Fishing for deepwater species required boats and knowledge of productive fishing grounds. Herring and eulachon provided important seasonal resources. Herring spawn in shallow waters during spring. Spawning events attracted massive congregations of fish. Groups harvested herring using rakes, nets, and other techniques. Herring eggs deposited on kelp and other substrates were also collected and consumed. Eulachon, small oily fish, migrated into rivers during late winter and early spring. These fish runs occurred before salmon runs, providing fresh protein during a critical season. Eulachon were dried and smoked for storage. Oil rendered from eulachon served nutritional and trade purposes. Terrestrial resources complemented marine-based subsistence. Deer and elk inhabited coastal forests and provided meat, hides, and raw materials. Hunting strategies included individual stalking and communal drives. Mountain goats occupied alpine areas and were hunted for meat and wool. Bear hunting occurred opportunistically. Bears sometimes competed with humans for salmon during spawning runs. Plant foods included numerous berry species, roots, shoots, and seeds. Salmon berries, salal berries, and huckleberries ripened at different times during summer and fall. Root crops required processing to become palatable. Camas bulbs contain inulin that causes digestive distress unless cooked. Groups pit-roasted camas bulbs for extended periods to convert inulin to digestible sugars. Wapato tubers grew in wetland areas and provided starchy calories. Fern rhizomes and other underground plant parts contributed to diets. Collection and processing of plant foods required substantial labor. Women typically conducted plant gathering and processing activities. Labor organization reflected the seasonal and geographic distribution of resources. Salmon fishing required coordinated group effort during peak runs. Weir construction and maintenance demanded cooperative labor. Net fishing involved multiple participants. Processing and storing fish engaged entire communities. Shellfish gathering could be conducted individually, but often occurred as group activities. Marine mammal hunting required crews to operate boats and deploy hunting equipment. Different tasks engage different demographic segments of communities. Storage technologies enabled accumulation of surplus resources. Dried salmon, dried shellfish, rendered oils, and dried berries could be stored for extended periods. Storage facilities included wooden boxes, baskets, and specialized structures. The capacity to store food surpluses reduced subsistence risk and supported larger residential populations. Stored food sustained communities through winter when fresh resource availability declined. Surplus production also enabled trade with groups occupying different environmental zones. Trade networks distributed resources across regions. Coastal groups exchanged marine products for interior resources. Dried salmon and eulachon oil moved inland. Obsidian, a volcanic glass used for tools, originated in interior volcanic areas and was traded to the coast. Dentalium shells, valued as prestige items and currency, came from specific offshore locations and circulated widely. Trade relationships connected coastal and interior populations in complex economic networks. Evidence for exchange appears in archaeological contexts as non-local materials. Obsidian sources can be identified through geochemical analysis. Obsidian artifacts found in coastal sites originated from sources hundreds of kilometers away. This distribution demonstrates long-distance movement of materials through trade or direct procurement. Other exotic materials, including specific shell species and stone types, also indicate exchange networks. The scale and intensity of trade increased over time. Subsistence strategies intensified during the late Holocene. Archaeological evidence indicates increased exploitation of salmon and shellfish. Midden accumulation rates accelerate in many areas after approximately 3,000 years ago. This intensification supported growing populations. It also required increased labor investment in harvesting, processing, and storage activities. Intensification may have been driven by population pressure or by social demands for surplus production to support emerging hierarchies. Resource ownership and access rights likely developed as populations grew and resources intensified. Specific fishing locations, shellfish beds, and hunting territories may have been controlled by particular lineages or communities. Archaeological evidence cannot directly demonstrate ownership systems. However, ethnographic accounts describe complex resource tenure arrangements. The archaeological pattern of persistent occupation at specific locations suggests continuity of access and possibly ownership. Control over productive resource locations provided economic and social advantages. The marine-focused economy of the Pacific Northwest coast supported population densities unusual for non-agricultural societies. Estimates suggest pre-contact populations exceeded 100,000 individuals for the region. Local densities reached levels comparable to agricultural societies in some areas. This demographic pattern derived from the exceptional productivity and predictability of key marine resources. The subsistence foundation enabled social and cultural developments that characterized the region in late prehistory. Stone tool production and use characterized technological activities throughout the prehistoric sequence in the Pacific Northwest Coast region. Regional stone resources determined available raw materials. Basalt, various cherts, obsidian, and other lithic materials served different purposes. Groups developed specific traditions for manufacturing and using stone implements. Alongside stone technology, organic materials including wood, bone, antler, and fiber played essential roles. Most organic technologies leave minimal archaeological traces. The fragmentary preservation creates an incomplete picture of technological capabilities. Chipped stone tool production followed several patterns. Biface manufacture created symmetrically flaked implements, including projectile points and knives. Bifacial reduction involved removing flakes from both surfaces of a core to create a desired form. Projectile points changed morphologically through time. Early points tend to be stemmed or leaf-shaped forms. Later periods see development of side-notched and corner-notched varieties. Point style changes allow archaeologists to establish chronological sequences. However, multiple point styles often coexisted, complicating simple chronological assignments. Core and flake technology provided cutting and scraping implements. Cores were struck to detach sharp flakes. These flakes required minimal modification before use. Edge wear analysis demonstrates that unmodified flakes served many functions. Some flakes received deliberate retouch to create specific edge angles or shapes. Scrapers formed from thick flakes or core fragments show evidence of hide working and wood scraping. The expedient nature of much flake tool production meant that implements were manufactured, used, and discarded in rapid succession. Microblade technology appeared in northern coastal areas, as mentioned in earlier contexts. Microblades represent a specialized core reduction technique. Small prismatic blades were detached from carefully prepared cores. These blades were then hafted into grooved bone or antler points to create cutting edges. Microblade technology appears most commonly in sites dating between 10,000 and 6,000 years ago. The tradition gradually disappeared from the southern portions of the coastal region. Northern areas maintained microblade production longer. Groundstone technology increased in importance over time. Grinding and polishing techniques created implements that could not be produced through flaking. Groundstone celts functioned as woodworking tools. These implements consist of elongated stones ground to create sharp bits. Celts were hafted into wooden handles to create adzes or axes. Woodworking required substantial effort given the large trees characteristic of coastal forests. Ground stone celts proved more durable than chipped stone implements for heavy-duty tasks. Mauls and hammers represent another ground stone category. These heavy implements served for driving wedges, pounding materials, and other percussive tasks. Mauls typically consist of cylindrical or ovoid stones with pecked grooves for hafting. Some examples show elaborate shaping and finishing. Large mauls weigh several kilograms. The effort invested in manufacturing these implements indicates their functional importance. Mauls were essential for splitting cedar logs and planks used in house construction. Groundstone abraders and whetstones maintained other implements. These tools consist of sandstone or other abrasive rocks used to sharpen or reshape edges. Abraders show grooves from repeated sharpening of bone awls, antler points, and stone tools. Whetstones exhibit smooth surfaces from edge maintenance activities. The presence of these tools indicates attention to maintaining functional edges on other implements. Processing tools for plant foods included various grinding implements. Manos and metates formed matched sets for grinding seeds, roots, and other materials. A mano is a handheld grinding stone. A metate provides the stationary grinding surface. These implements appear less commonly in coastal sites than in interior regions. Coastal groups relied more heavily on animal proteins and required less intensive plant processing. However, some plant foods, including certain roots, required grinding or pounding. Mortars and pestles served similar processing functions. Stone mortars consist of boulders or slabs with excavated depressions. Pestles are cylindrical stones used to pound materials in mortar depressions. Wooden mortars also existed, but rarely preserve. Stone pestles indicate the former presence of wooden mortars in many cases. Processing fish, berries, and other foods sometimes employed pounding rather than grinding. The choice between grinding and pounding depended on the material being processed. Stone net weights facilitated fishing activities. These implements consist of perforated stones, notched cobbles, or shaped stones with grooves. Net weights attached to fishing nets to keep them submerged or maintain specific positions. The form and size of net weights varied by net type and fishing method. Small perforated stones served as weights for individual lines or small nets. Large notched cobbles anchored larger net systems. The abundance of net weights at fishing sites indicates the importance of net fishing technology. Stone clubs or hand mauls functioned as weapons and tools. These implements consist of deliberately shaped cobbles or sculpted stones. Some examples show careful pecking and grinding to create specific forms. Clubs served to dispatch marine mammals and fish. They may also have functioned as weapons in interpersonal conflict. The dual-use nature of many implements makes functional assignment difficult, based solely on form. Woodworking technology relied primarily on organic materials that rarely survive. Cedar provided the primary raw material for most wooden objects. Its straight grain, resistance to decay, and workability made it ideal for many purposes. Groups manufactured canoes, house planks, storage boxes, weapons, and numerous other items from cedar. The scale of wooden construction projects, including large houses and ocean-going canoes, demonstrates sophisticated woodworking capabilities. Canoe construction required substantial skill and labor investment. Canoes were manufactured from single logs. A suitable cedar log was felled and rough-shaped. The interior was excavated using fire and adzes. Heat and water allowed wood to be bent to widen the canoe. Different canoe forms served different purposes. River canoes differed from ocean-going vessels. The largest canoes measured more than 15 meters in length and could carry multiple tons. These vessels enabled ocean travel, fishing, hunting, trading, and raiding. Wedge technology facilitated splitting cedar logs into planks. Wooden or stone wedges were driven into logs using heavy mauls. Controlled splitting produced relatively uniform planks. These planks formed walls and roofs of plank houses. House construction consumed enormous quantities of split planks. Some houses measured more than 20 meters in length. The labor investment in house construction indicates substantial group size and cooperation. Houses represented significant capital investments that encouraged residential stability. Basketry and fiber technologies produced containers, clothing, and other items. Woven baskets served storage and transport functions. Different weaving techniques created varied forms and capacities. Some baskets were woven tightly enough to hold water. Cedar bark provided raw material for many woven items. Inner bark was processed through beating, shredding, and preparation. Women conducted most basket manufacture. The skill required to produce well-made baskets necessitated substantial learning and practice. Clothing consisted primarily of woven items and prepared hides. Cedar bark clothing included capes, skirts, and hats. These items shed rain effectively in the wet coastal climate. Animal hides provided additional clothing materials. Hide preparation required scraping, cleaning, and sometimes smoking. Specialized skin clothing included waterproof garments made from marine mammal intestines. These garments protected against ocean spray during maritime activities. Fishing technology utilized multiple approaches and implements. Fish hooks of composite construction combined wooden shanks with bone or shell points. Hook designs varied by target species. Halibut hooks incorporated features suited to bottom fishing. Cod hooks differed in form and size. Trolling hooks allowed surface fishing for salmon. The variety of hook forms demonstrates detailed knowledge of fish behavior and effective capture methods. Harpoon technology enabled marine mammal hunting. Harpoons consisted of detachable heads connected to shafts by lines. When a harpoon struck an animal, the head detached but remained connected via the line. The wounded animal could not escape and tired as it pulled against resistance. Different harpoon head forms existed for different prey species. Seal harpoons differed from larger implements used for sea lions or whales. Manufacture of composite harpoons required working bone, antler, wood, and cordage materials. Spears and lances served both hunting and fishing functions. Spear points were manufactured from bone, antler, or stone. Multi-pronged fish spears or lysters increased chances of striking fast-moving fish. Barbed points prevented speared fish from escaping. The diversity of point forms indicates specialized designs for specific prey or conditions. Spear technology appears in archaeological contexts from the earliest occupations through late prehistory. Bow and arrow technology supplemented atlatl and dart systems in later periods. The timing of bow adoption in the Pacific Northwest coast remains debated. Small projectile points that may represent arrow points appear in assemblages dating to approximately 1,500 years ago. Earlier, larger points likely functioned as dart points for atlatl systems or as knife blades. The transition from atlatl to bow may have occurred gradually with both systems coexisting. Blade technology using organic materials left limited direct evidence. However, the presence of blade handles and hafts indicates that blades were important implements. Stone blades served cutting functions, but dulled rapidly when used on fibrous materials. Shell blades provided alternative cutting edges. Mussel shell fractured to create sharp edges. Some shell fragments showed deliberate modification to create blade forms. The use of shell as blade material exploited abundant local resources. Tool assemblages varied spatially across the landscape. Sites near fishing locations contain abundant net weights and processing tools. Hunting camps show higher frequencies of projectile points. Quarry sites near lithic sources preserve evidence of initial core reduction and tool blank production. The spatial variation in tool frequencies indicates functional differentiation of sites. Groups moved across landscapes conducting different activities at different locations. Technological knowledge transmitted across generations through observation and practice. Children learned tool manufacture and use by watching adults and attempting production themselves. The learning process produced debris that appears archaeologically as crude or failed attempts. Some artifacts show evidence of beginner mistakes. The persistence of specific technological traditions indicates successful transmission of manufacturing knowledge. Regional technological styles developed and persisted over centuries. Environmental conditions in the Pacific Northwest coast changed significantly during the Holocene. These changes affected resource availability, settlement locations, and subsistence strategies. Climate fluctuations occurred at multiple scales, from brief events to millennial trends. Groups adapted to environmental variability through technological adjustments, settlement shifts, and economic reorganization. The archaeological record preserves evidence of both environmental changes and human responses. The terminal Pleistocene transition to Holocene conditions began approximately 11,700 years ago. Global temperatures increased substantially. Ice sheets retreated rapidly. Sea levels rose as glacial meltwater returned to oceans. The Pacific Northwest coast experienced profound environmental restructuring during this transition. Landscapes that had been ice-covered became available for colonization by plants, animals, and humans. River systems established new courses as ice dams broke and topography adjusted. Temperature increases during the early Holocene created conditions warmer than present in many regions. This warm period extended from approximately 10,000 to 6,000 years ago. Different areas experienced peak warming at different times. Evidence suggests reduced effective moisture in some locations. Tree ring records and pollen sequences indicate drier conditions than present in portions of the region. Reduced precipitation affected river flows and potentially salmon populations. Forest composition changed in response to early Holocene warming. Pollen cores from lakes and bogs preserve evidence of vegetation shifts. Lodgepole pine and Douglas fir expanded in some areas during warm, dry intervals. Moisture-dependent species, including western hemlock, became less abundant. These compositional changes affected resources available to human populations. Changes in forest structure influenced deer and elk populations. Shifts in plant species altered availability of edible plants and raw materials. The warm, dry interval, sometimes termed the hypsothermal, affected different parts of the coast, variably. Some areas experienced significant drying. Others saw minimal change. The Fraser River Valley shows evidence of reduced effective moisture between approximately 8,000 and 5,000 years ago. Archaeological sites in this area may have been abandoned or used less intensively during peak aridity. Groups potentially shifted to coastal locations, where marine resources remained reliable despite terrestrial drying. Salmon populations respond to environmental conditions, including water temperature, flow levels, and ocean productivity. Warmer temperatures and lower stream flows stress salmon. Archaeological evidence from some river systems shows reduced salmon bone frequencies during warm intervals. This pattern suggests decreased salmon abundance or shifts in human harvesting locations. Groups dependent on specific salmon runs may have moved to rivers with more reliable runs. Alternatively, they may have increased reliance on shellfish and other marine resources. Cooling and increased precipitation began approximately 5,000 years ago. This shift initiated a trend toward cooler, wetter conditions. Modern climate patterns became established during this interval. Increased precipitation enhanced river flows. Salmon populations likely expanded in response to improved spawning conditions. Archaeological sites increase in number and size after this climatic shift. The correlation between improved conditions and intensified occupation suggests environmental factors influenced population growth. Short-term climate fluctuations occurred within longer trends. Century-scale variations affected resource availability. Evidence exists for periodic droughts, floods, and temperature anomalies. These shorter events required adaptive responses by human populations. Groups maintaining diverse subsistence strategies could buffer against short-term resource failures. Populations specialized on single resources faced greater risk during environmental perturbations. Volcanic eruptions created abrupt environmental impacts. Mount Mazama erupted approximately 7,700 years ago in present-day Oregon. This eruption deposited volcanic ash across a wide area. Ash layers appear in archaeological and geological deposits throughout the region. The eruption produced immediate local devastation. Downwind areas received ashfall that affected vegetation and water quality. Archaeological sites show evidence of abandonment in heavily affected areas. The Mazama ash layer provides a useful chronological marker. Deposits below the ash predate 7,700 years ago. Deposits above the ash postdate the eruption. This stratigraphic marker assists in dating sites and reconstructing chronological sequences. Other smaller volcanic events occurred periodically. These eruptions created localized disturbances, but lacked the regional impact of the Mazama eruption. Earthquakes and tsunamis affected coastal populations episodically. The Pacific Northwest coast lies in a seismically active zone. Subduction of oceanic crust beneath continental crust generates major earthquakes. Large earthquakes occur at intervals of several centuries. These events produce coastal subsidence and tsunamis. Archaeological evidence documents tsunami deposits at some coastal sites. Sand layers containing marine shells appear suddenly in marsh deposits. These deposits indicate tsunami inundation. The most recent major earthquake occurred in January 1700. This magnitude 9 event caused widespread coastal subsidence. Archaeological sites show evidence of sudden burial by tsunami sands. Some coastal villages were destroyed or abandoned. Oral traditions from coastal groups preserve memories of major earthquakes and tsunamis. These accounts describe ground shaking, ocean recession, and devastating waves. The archaeological and oral evidence combined demonstrate that prehistoric populations experienced multiple major seismic events. Sea level changes continued at smaller scales after initial post-glacial rise. Relative sea level fluctuated due to isostatic adjustment and tectonic processes. Some areas experienced gradual emergence as land rebounded from ice sheet removal. Other areas subsided due to tectonic forces. These vertical movements altered coastal configurations. Archaeological sites that were once on shorelines now occur inland or below water, depending on local movement patterns. Ocean conditions influenced marine resource productivity. Sea surface temperatures fluctuated on decadal and longer scales. The Pacific decadal oscillation creates alternating warm and cool phases, affecting the northeastern Pacific. These phases influence ocean productivity and fish populations. El Niño events cause periodic warming with impacts on marine ecosystems. Archaeological records of fish remains may reflect these oceanographic fluctuations. Changes in fish species composition or abundance through site sequences could indicate oceanographic shifts. Human responses to environmental change varied by circumstance. Groups adopted several strategies to manage environmental variability. Residential mobility allowed populations to shift locations in response to resource failures. Groups could abandon areas experiencing poor conditions and relocate to more productive zones. The archaeological evidence of intermittent site occupation may reflect mobility responses to environmental fluctuations. Diversification of subsistence resources buffered against specific resource failures. Groups exploiting multiple resource types faced lower risk than specialized populations. If salmon runs failed, shellfish, marine mammals, and terrestrial resources could compensate. The broad-spectrum subsistence pattern characteristic of coastal populations provided resilience against environmental perturbations. Archaeological faunal assemblages showing diverse species indicate risk management strategies. Storage technology allowed groups to accumulate surpluses during productive periods. Stored resources could sustain populations through intervals of resource scarcity. The development of effective storage technologies enabled populations to weather short-term environmental fluctuations. Archaeological evidence of storage facilities increases through time. This pattern suggests that storage became more important as populations grew and became more sedentary. Social networks provided another buffering mechanism. Groups maintained relationships with populations in other areas. These relationships allowed movement of people and resources during crises. If resources failed locally, groups could relocate temporarily to areas with better conditions. Alternatively, they could obtain resources through exchange with neighboring groups. The trade networks evident in archaeological distributions of non-local materials may have served social insurance functions. Intensification of resource extraction represents another response to environmental or demographic pressure. Groups invested more labor to extract greater yields from existing resources. Evidence for intensification includes increased site sizes, larger shell middens, more complex fishing facilities, and specialized processing technologies. Intensification allowed populations to maintain or increase resource yields despite environmental constraints or growing populations. Environmental changes created opportunities as well as challenges. New resource concentrations emerged as conditions shifted. Groups able to exploit newly available resources gained advantages. Salmon runs expanded into rivers as conditions improved. Shellfish beds developed in newly formed estuarine environments. The colonization of new resource patches appears in the archaeological record as expansion into previously unoccupied areas. Long-term trends in climate and environment shaped cultural trajectories. The shift toward cooler, wetter conditions after 5,000 years ago created environments highly productive for key resources. This environmental improvement supported population growth and cultural elaboration. The late prehistoric fluorescence of Northwest coast cultures coincided with favorable environmental conditions. Whether cultural complexity resulted primarily from environmental abundance or from social and technological developments remains debated. Climate and environmental reconstructions derive from multiple sources. Pollen cores provide evidence of vegetation changes. Tree ring sequences preserve records of temperature and precipitation variations. Glacial advances and retreats indicate temperature trends. Marine sediment cores contain information about ocean conditions. Combining these proxy records creates regional environmental histories. Matching environmental histories with archaeological sequences allows assessment of human-environment interactions. The relationship between environmental change and cultural change proves complex. Environmental conditions constrained possibilities but did not determine outcomes. Human groups made choices about how to respond to environmental circumstances. Different populations facing similar environmental conditions sometimes developed different cultural patterns. Understanding cultural developments requires considering environmental contexts without assuming environmental determinism. The Pacific Northwest Coast archaeological sequence demonstrates both environmental influences and human agency in shaping cultural trajectories. The Pacific Northwest Coast encompassed multiple distinct environmental zones within its geographic extent. These zones supported different resource concentrations and required different adaptive strategies. Regional variation in environments produced corresponding variation in archaeological patterns. Groups occupying different zones developed specialized technologies and subsistence practices. Over time, distinct regional traditions emerged that archaeologists identify through artifact styles, settlement patterns, and economic emphases. The outer coast faced the open Pacific Ocean. This zone experienced heavy wave action, rocky shorelines, and access to pelagic resources. Outer coast environments offered abundant marine mammals, offshore fish species, and shellfish adapted to high-energy conditions. Groups occupying this zone required sophisticated maritime technology. Ocean-going canoes capable of handling rough seas proved essential. Halibut fishing occurred in deep offshore waters. Sea otter hunting took place in kelp beds along the outer coast. Archaeological sites on the outer coast often occupy protected locations behind headlands or in river mouths. These positions provided shelter from prevailing winds and waves while maintaining ocean access. Site distribution reflects the limited availability of suitable settlement locations. Outer coast sites, contain high frequencies of marine mammal remains. Fish assemblages include deepwater species. Stone tool inventories emphasize materials for processing maritime resources. The inner coast included protected waterways such as Puget Sound, the Strait of Georgia, and the Inside Passage. These areas experienced calmer water conditions. Navigation proved easier than on the outer coast. Protected waters supported different marine resources than open ocean environments. Herring spawning occurred in shallow protected bays. Shellfish beds developed extensively in calm intertidal areas. Salmon entered rivers draining into these protected waters. Inner coast settlements often reached substantial sizes. Protected shorelines allowed villages to develop directly on beaches. Multiple house structures clustered along shorelines at major sites. Shell middens accumulated to great depths from intensive shellfish harvesting. Inner coast sites show evidence of longer occupations and greater residential stability than outer coast locations. The sheltered environment permitted year-round maritime activities. River valleys provided critical corridors between coast and interior. Major rivers, including the Columbia and Fraser, created distinct environmental zones. Lower river reaches contained tidal influences and supported estuarine resources. Upper reaches transitioned to freshwater environments. River valleys channeled salmon runs and served as transportation routes. Groups positioned along rivers could intercept salmon during spawning migrations. River mouth sites occupied strategic positions for salmon harvesting. These locations allowed exploitation of both marine and riverine resources. Archaeological sites at major river mouths often show intensive occupation. The Dalles along the Columbia River constituted one of the most important fishing locations in the region. Groups congregated at this location during salmon runs. The abundance of salmon supported large temporary populations. Intensive processing and trading occurred at major fishing stations. Interior valleys west of the Cascade Crest experienced different conditions than coastal areas. These valleys received less precipitation than coastal zones, but remained relatively moist. Douglas fir and oak forests characterized lower elevations. Rivers draining these valleys supported salmon runs. Groups occupying interior valleys combined riverine fishing with terrestrial hunting. Deer and elk populations reached high densities in valley environments. The transition from highly mobile to more sedentary settlement patterns occurred at different times in different regions. Coastal areas with exceptional marine resources supported earlier sedentism. Interior valleys maintained higher mobility longer. This variation reflects different resource structures. Predictable, concentrated coastal resources permitted permanent settlements. More dispersed interior resources required continued mobility to access seasonal abundance. Mountain zones above major valleys offered seasonal resources. High elevation areas provided summer hunting opportunities. Mountain goats inhabited steep terrain. Deer moved to high elevations during summer. Alpine meadows produced edible plants during brief growing seasons. Groups conducted seasonal expeditions to mountain areas. Archaeological evidence in alpine settings consists primarily of hunting camps and tool manufacturing locations. The Columbia Plateau region east of the Cascades maintained connections with coastal populations. Plateau groups occupied an arid interior environment dominated by sagebrush steppe. Salmon runs ascending the Columbia River system provided critical resources. Groups along the Columbia harvested enormous quantities of salmon at locations like Kettle Falls and Celilo Falls. These interior fishing stations functioned analogously to coastal fishing villages. Exchange relationships connected coastal and plateau populations. Coastal groups traded dried fish and marine products. Plateau groups provided interior resources, including plant foods, hides, and obsidian. The Columbia River served as a major trade corridor. Archaeological evidence demonstrates movement of materials between coast and interior. Obsidian from plateau sources appears in coastal sites. Marine shells occur in plateau contexts. Northern coastal regions differed from southern areas in several respects. Northern areas experienced colder climates and later deglaciation. Some northern regions remained ice-covered until approximately 13,000 years ago. This late deglaciation meant human occupation began later in far northern areas. Northern groups developed specialized adaptations to colder environments and different resource concentrations. Eulachon runs proved particularly important in northern rivers. These small, oily fish provided essential fats. Northern groups rendered Eulachon oil through specialized processing techniques. The oil served nutritional needs and trade purposes. Eulachon oil became a valuable trade commodity distributed across wide areas. Control over productive Eulachon streams conferred economic advantages. Southern portions of the Pacific Northwest coast transitioned toward California cultural patterns. The boundary between Northwest coast and California culture areas remained indistinct. Groups in Northern California and Southern Oregon showed characteristics of both regions. Settlement patterns, subsistence practices, and technologies reflected influences from both areas. Archaeological assemblages contain elements characteristic of both cultural traditions. Linguistic diversity correlated imperfectly with archaeological patterns. Multiple language families occupied the coastal region. Cilician languages dominated the central coast and interior valleys. Wakashan languages occurred along portions of the outer coast. Athapascan speakers occupied some coastal areas in Oregon and California. Tlingit and Haida represented distinct language families in the north. Language distributions reflect complex population histories not fully understood from archaeological evidence alone. Regional archaeological traditions became increasingly distinct over time. Early assemblages show relatively little regional variation. Later periods demonstrate stronger regional patterning. This increasing regionalization may reflect population growth, reduced mobility, and development of distinct cultural identities. Regional artifact styles allowed archaeologists to define cultural complexes and phases. The Locarno Beach phase characterized the southern coast between approximately 3,000 and 2,400 years ago. This phase showed evidence of increasing sedentism and intensified marine resource use. House structures appear in deposits of this age. Groundstone tools increase in frequency. The Locarno Beach phase represents a transitional period toward greater cultural complexity. The Marpole phase succeeded Locarno Beach between approximately 2,400 and 1,000 years ago. Marpole occupations show evidence of substantial villages, elaborate art styles, and social differentiation. Groundstone sculpture appears during this phase. Labres, ornaments worn in lip piercings, indicate status distinctions. Burial patterns show differential treatment suggesting social hierarchy. Northern coastal regions developed different phase sequences. The Prince Rupert Harbor area in British Columbia preserves a long occupation sequence. Early periods show relatively simple assemblages. Later periods demonstrate increasing cultural elaboration. Large villages, elaborate artifacts, and evidence of social ranking appear in deposits dating to the last 2,000 years. Coastal and interior populations maintained different trajectories. Interior plateau groups remained more mobile longer than coastal populations. Permanent villages developed later in interior areas. However, major fishing stations along the Columbia River supported seasonal aggregations comparable to coastal villages in size. Interior groups developed distinctive pithouse architectural traditions differing from coastal plank houses. The diversity of regional patterns complicates broad generalizations about Pacific Northwest coast prehistory. Different areas experience different developmental sequences. Some regions showed early cultural elaboration. Others developed complexity later. Environmental variation contributed to these differences. Social and historical factors also played roles. Population movements, interactions, and innovations occurred at local and regional scales. Understanding regional variation requires detailed local sequences. Archaeologists construct chronologies for specific areas based on stratigraphy, radiocarbon dating, and artifact seriation. These local sequences can then be compared across regions. Similarities and differences between sequences reveal patterns of interaction, isolation, and parallel development. The accumulation of regional data continues to refine understanding of prehistoric cultural geography. Regional differentiation extended to subsistence emphasis. Some areas focused heavily on salmon. Others relied more on shellfish or marine mammals. The relative importance of different resources varied by environmental availability and cultural choice. Archaeological faunal assemblages preserve evidence of these emphases. Quantitative analysis of bone and shell frequencies reveals subsistence priorities. Technological traditions also varied regionally. Stone tool styles differed between areas. Ground stone sculpture concentrated in certain regions. Specific artifact types characterized particular areas. These stylistic variations may reflect different cultural traditions, functional requirements, or raw material availability. Distinguishing between functional and stylistic variation requires careful analysis. The regional mosaic of the Pacific Northwest coast created a complex cultural landscape. Groups occupying different environments developed distinctive adaptations while maintaining connections through trade and social networks. This combination of regional specialization and inter-regional interaction characterized the coastal cultural system. The archaeological record preserves evidence of both differentiation and connection across the diverse environments of the Pacific Northwest coast. Archaeological evidence indicates increasing social complexity in Pacific Northwest coast societies during the late Holocene. Social differentiation, status hierarchies, and institutionalized leadership emerged in many areas. Material indicators of these developments appear in burial practices, artifact distributions, and settlement patterns. The timing and nature of social complexity varied across regions. Some areas developed hierarchical organization earlier than others. Understanding these developments requires examining multiple lines of evidence. Burial practices provide insights into social organization. Early burials show relatively uniform treatment of individuals. Bodies were interred with minimal grave goods. Burial locations varied, but showed no clear patterning suggesting status differences. This pattern characterizes most burials dating before approximately 4,000 years ago. The uniformity suggests relatively egalitarian social organization during early periods. Changes in burial practices appear in later periods. Some individuals received elaborate burial treatment. These burials contain numerous grave goods, including tools, ornaments, and exotic materials. Other contemporary burials contain few or no grave goods. The differential treatment indicates social distinctions. Individuals receiving elaborate burial likely held high status during life. The emergence of differential burial treatment suggests development of social hierarchies. Grave goods in high-status burials included specific artifact types. Groundstone sculpture appears in some elite burials. Carved bowls, clubs, and other items demonstrate artistic skill and labor investment. Copper ornaments occur in some contexts. Copper sources lay distant from most coastal areas. Acquisition of copper required trade connections. The presence of copper indicates access to exchange networks. Labrets represent another status indicator. These ornaments were inserted through perforations below the lower lip. Labret manufacture required specialized skill. Materials included stone, bone, and shell. Size and material quality varied. Large, elaborate labrets likely indicated high status. Labrets appear predominantly in burials dating to the last 2,000 years. Their distribution suggests they functioned as status markers in late prehistoric societies. Cranial modification occurred in some coastal populations. Infant heads were bound to create deliberately shaped skulls. This practice altered cranial form permanently. Modified crania appear in burial populations from certain areas and time periods. The social meaning of cranial modification remains debated. It may have indicated group membership, status, or aesthetic preference. The practice demonstrates cultural elaboration beyond purely functional concerns. Dentalia shells served as prestige items and currency in late prehistoric times. These tubular shells came from specific offshore locations. Harvesting dentalia required specialized knowledge and diving capability. The shells were strung and measured by length. Longer strings held greater value. Dentalia circulated widely through trade networks. Their use as standardized valuables indicates economic sophistication. Evidence for violence appears episodically in the archaeological record. Some skeletal remains show trauma indicating interpersonal conflict. Projectile points embedded in bone demonstrate violent encounters. Defensive sites located on protected positions suggest concern about raiding. The frequency of violence indicators varies by region and time period. Some areas show substantial evidence. Others demonstrate minimal conflict signatures. Fortified sites provide evidence of organized conflict. Some late prehistoric villages occupied defensive positions on cliff tops or promontories. Wooden palisades surrounded some settlements. These defenses required coordinated labor and planning. The investment in fortifications indicates serious threats from raiding or warfare. Defensive architecture appears most commonly in late prehistoric contexts, dating to the last 1,000 years. Mass burial sites containing individuals with trauma suggest warfare casualties. Several sites preserve burials of multiple individuals killed simultaneously. Wound patterns indicate violent deaths. The simultaneous deaths suggest conflict events rather than accumulated individual violence. These mass burials demonstrate that organized violence affected prehistoric populations. The scale and organization of violence increased in late prehistory. Slavery existed in some late prehistoric coastal societies. Archaeological evidence for slavery remains limited. Skeletal evidence cannot reliably identify slave status. However, certain burial patterns may indicate servile status. Individuals buried in marginal locations without grave goods might represent slaves. The practice of slavery is well documented ethnographically for the contact period. Archaeological evidence suggests the institution existed earlier, but its antiquity remains uncertain. Resource ownership likely contributed to social differentiation. Control over productive fishing locations, shellfish beds, or other resources provided economic advantages. Groups or individuals controlling prime resources could accumulate wealth. This wealth might be converted into status through feasting, gift-giving, or sponsoring ceremonies. The archaeological distribution of sites suggests persistent occupation of optimal locations. This persistence may indicate continuity of ownership. Storage capacity influenced social dynamics. Groups with greater storage capability could accumulate larger surpluses. Surplus accumulation enabled social investments, including feasting and ceremonies. Archaeological evidence of storage facilities includes specialized structures and large quantities of storage containers. The scale of storage capacity increased over time in many areas. This increase suggests that surplus accumulation became more important socially. Plank house architecture represents substantial capital investment. Large houses required enormous labor to construct. Trees were felled, split into planks, and assembled into structures. Some houses measured over 20 meters in length. These buildings housed multiple families. The size and permanence of plank houses indicates residential stability and social organization capable of coordinating large construction projects. House size variation within villages may indicate status differences. Some structures substantially exceeded others in dimensions. Larger houses potentially belonged to higher status lineages. Position within village layouts might also reflect status. Central or prominent locations could indicate prestige. However, interpreting social meaning from house size and position remains speculative without additional corroborating evidence. Ceremonial or communal structures appear at some sites. These buildings exceeded domestic houses in size or showed specialized features. Some structures lacked domestic debris, suggesting specialized functions. Communal buildings served gatherings, ceremonies, or feasting events. The construction of specialized ceremonial architecture indicates social organization beyond household level. Artistic production increased in sophistication and quantity during late prehistory. Stone sculpture, carved wood, and decorated objects demonstrate artistic traditions. Some artistic styles achieved high technical and aesthetic quality. Production of elaborate art objects required specialized skills. Artists likely held specific social positions. Commissioned artworks may have served status display or ceremonial functions. Certain artifact types appear primarily in high-status contexts. Elaborate groundstone bowls occur in elite burials and at major village sites. These objects required substantial labor to manufacture. Their distribution suggests restricted access. Similarly, some carved objects appear only in specific contexts. The restricted distribution indicates that certain items served as status markers or ceremonial objects. Evidence for craft specialization appears in late prehistoric contexts. Some sites contain concentrations of manufacturing debris, suggesting specialized production. Shell bead manufacturing sites show evidence of intensive production. Stone tool manufacturing locations preserve evidence of mass production. Specialization allowed efficient production of trade goods. Specialists may have held particular social positions within communities. Exchange systems became more complex and extensive over time. Long-distance trade networks distributed materials across hundreds of kilometers. The volume of trade increased in late prehistory. Standardized trade goods, including dentalia shells, obsidian, and copper, circulated widely. The organization required to maintain extensive trade networks suggests institutional development beyond simple reciprocal exchange. Feasting provided a mechanism for status competition and validation. Archaeological evidence for feasting includes concentrations of food refuse, specialized serving vessels, and remnants of large-scale food preparation. Feasting events required surplus accumulation and distribution. Hosts gained prestige through generous provisioning. Competitive feasting may have driven resource intensification and surplus production. The potlatch ceremony, documented ethnographically, likely had prehistoric origins. Potlatches involved ceremonial gift-giving, feasting, and status validation. Hosts distributed wealth to guests in elaborate ceremonies. These events served multiple social functions, including establishing rank, celebrating life events, and maintaining alliances. Archaeological evidence cannot directly demonstrate potlatch practices. However, the material signatures of surplus accumulation, prestige goods, and feasting suggest similar institutions existed prehistorically. Population growth contributed to social complexity development. Larger populations required more elaborate organization, mechanisms for conflict resolution, resource allocation, and decision-making became necessary. Leadership positions emerged to coordinate group activities. Leaders gained authority through demonstrated ability, hereditary position, or control of resources. The emergence of hereditary leadership represents a significant social transition. Early societies likely selected leaders based on personal qualities. Later societies institutionalized leadership in lineages. Chiefly positions passed through family lines. This transition created permanent status differences. Archaeological evidence cannot directly demonstrate hereditary succession. However, the appearance of wealthy child burials suggests inherited status. Children could not achieve status through personal accomplishment. Their elaborate burials indicate status derived from family position. Social complexity varied across the Pacific Northwest coast. Some areas developed marked hierarchies. Others maintained more egalitarian organization. Northern coastal groups generally showed stronger evidence of social ranking than southern populations. This variation may reflect environmental differences, population densities, or historical developments. Understanding regional variation in social complexity remains an active research area. The relationship between environmental abundance and social complexity proves complex. Rich environments permitted population growth and surplus accumulation. However, environmental productivity alone did not determine social organization. Groups made choices about how to organize socially. Some populations with access to abundant resources maintained relatively egalitarian organization. Others developed marked hierarchies. Social complexity resulted from interactions between environmental, demographic, and cultural factors. The late prehistoric period in the Pacific Northwest coast encompasses approximately the last 2,000 years before European contact. This interval witnessed intensification of existing patterns and emergence of social configurations documented ethnographically. Population levels increased substantially. Settlement patterns stabilized around permanent village locations. Resource exploitation intensified to support growing populations. Trade networks expanded in geographic scope and volume. Social hierarchies became more pronounced. The material record from this period provides the richest archaeological evidence for understanding prehistoric coastal societies. Population growth characterizes the late prehistoric period across most regions. Archaeological sites increase in number and size. Shell midden accumulation rates accelerate. House structures become larger and more numerous. These patterns indicate growing populations. Estimates for total regional population at contact vary widely. Most assessments suggest populations exceeded 100,000 individuals. Local densities in prime locations approached levels comparable to agricultural societies. Population concentration occurred at favored locations. Major villages developed at river mouths, protected bays, and productive fishing stations. Some villages contained dozens of plank houses. These settlements functioned as year-round residential bases. Populations remained relatively sedentary compared to earlier periods. Seasonal mobility continued, but involved smaller portions of communities moving to specialized resource procurement locations. The largest villages occupied strategic positions, controlling access to key resources. Villages at major salmon rivers controlled fishing locations. Coastal villages dominated access to marine mammal rookeries, or productive shellfish beds. Control over resources translated into economic and political power. Village locations show remarkable continuity through late prehistory. Many ethnographically documented village sites contain archaeological deposits spanning centuries or millennia. House construction reached maximum elaboration during late prehistory. Plank houses of monumental proportions housed extended families or lineage segments. The largest structures exceeded 30 meters in length. House posts consisted of massive cedar logs. Carved posts displayed heraldic designs and artistic motifs. House construction represented major capital investments. The permanence and scale of houses indicates residential stability and social organization. Interior house features included hearths, sleeping platforms, and storage areas. Families occupied defined spaces within communal structures. Storage boxes and baskets lined house walls. dried fish, preserved berries, and other foods accumulated in quantity. The storage capacity of large houses allowed provisioning of substantial populations through winter months. House interiors also contained tools, weapons, clothing, and ceremonial objects. Village layouts followed consistent patterns in many areas. Houses aligned along beaches facing water. This orientation provided access to canoes and marine resources. Some villages included specialized structures such as ceremonial houses or chiefs' residences. Open areas between houses served as workspaces and gathering areas. Defensive features, including palisades, surrounded some villages. The organization of village space reflects social priorities and defensive concerns. Salmon fishing intensified during late prehistory. Archaeological evidence indicates increasingly sophisticated fishing technology. Weir systems became more elaborate. Some weirs extended across entire river channels. Maintenance of these structures required coordinated labor. The infrastructure investment indicates the critical importance of salmon to local economies. Groups competed for control of prime fishing locations. Processing facilities for salmon expanded in scale. Archaeological sites near major fisheries contain extensive processing areas. Fire-cracked rock accumulations indicate intensive cooking and smoking activities. The volume of processing debris demonstrates industrial-scale fish preservation. Dried salmon supported not only local consumption, but also trade with interior groups. Shellfish harvesting reached peak intensity. Some shell middens grew to enormous proportions. Deposits exceeding 5 meters deep and covering hectares document millennia of intensive harvesting. The scale of shellfish exploitation raises questions about sustainability. Evidence from some sites suggests declining shellfish sizes over time. This pattern may indicate overharvesting. Groups responded by expanding harvesting territories or shifting to alternative resources. Marine mammal hunting continued as an important activity. Harbor seal and sea lion populations provided meat, oil, and raw materials. Some groups specialized in sea otter hunting. Sea otter pelts became valuable trade items. Whaling occurred among certain northern groups. Whale hunting required exceptional skill and specialized ceremonial knowledge. Successful whale hunts provided enormous quantities of meat and oil. Herring fishing intensified as a seasonal activity. Spring herring spawning events attracted large aggregations. Groups harvested herring using specialized rakes and nets. Herring eggs deposited on kelp were collected and processed. The timing of herring runs before salmon returns made them particularly valuable. Herring provided fresh protein during late winter when stored foods depleted. Eulachon oil production became a major economic activity in northern areas. Rivers with large eulachon runs attracted seasonal gatherings. Fish were collected and rendered to extract oil. The rendering process involved fermenting fish and heating them to release oil. Eulachon oil achieved high value in trade networks. It traveled hundreds of kilometers from production sites. Trade routes for eulachon oil became known as grease trails. Plant food exploitation continued alongside animal resource harvesting. Berry gathering remained important for dietary diversity and preservation. Kamaz harvesting involved organized expeditions to productive meadows. Root vegetables, including wapato, provided carbohydrates. Plant foods contributed essential nutrients and dietary variety. Women conducted most plant gathering and processing activities. Technological refinement continued in late prehistory. Stone tool production achieved high levels of skill. Ground stone sculpture reached artistic peaks. Woodworking technologies produced increasingly elaborate canoes, houses, and carved objects. Basketry and weaving technologies created diverse container forms and clothing. The technological sophistication visible in late prehistoric artifacts demonstrates accumulated knowledge and specialized skills. Trade networks reached maximum geographic extent. Materials moved across vast distances through both direct procurement and down-the-line exchange. Obsidian from interior sources appeared in coastal sites hundreds of kilometers distant. Copper from Copper River in Alaska circulated throughout the coast. Dentalia shells from Vancouver Island traveled inland and north. Marine shells reached interior plateau and subarctic regions. Trade involved both utilitarian and prestige goods. Dried fish, eulachon oil, and shellfish constituted bulk trade items. Stone tools and raw materials served functional needs. Prestige goods, including copper, dentalia, and carved objects, circulated among elites. The volume and diversity of trade goods indicates complex economic networks. Some individuals or groups may have specialized in trading activities. Canoe technology reached high development in late prehistory. Large ocean-going canoes enabled long-distance travel and trade. Canoe designs varied by function. River canoes differed from ocean vessels. War canoes carried raiding parties. Trading canoes transported goods. The largest canoes could carry several tons and dozens of people. Construction of these vessels required exceptional skill and labor investment. Warfare and raiding increased during late prehistory. Evidence for conflict becomes more abundant. Fortified villages multiply. Skeletal trauma frequencies increase. Mass burials suggest violent encounters. Oral traditions preserved at contact describe endemic raiding and warfare. Competition for resources, slaves, and prestige motivated conflicts. Successful warriors gained status and influence. Defensive strategies included village fortifications and strategic positioning. Palisades consisting of vertical logs surrounded some settlements. Villages occupied defendable positions on cliffs or islands. Lookout positions provided warning of approaching raiders. These defensive investments indicate serious security concerns. The energy devoted to defense suggests violence constituted a significant threat. Weaponry included bows and arrows, spears, clubs, and daggers. Stone clubs with carved handles functioned as weapons. Some clubs featured elaborate artistic designs. Bone and antler daggers served as close combat weapons. Hide armor provided protection. Wooden slat armor and helmets appear in some contexts. The diversity of weapons and armor demonstrates martial sophistication. Slavery became institutionalized in late prehistoric societies. Captives taken in raids became slaves. Slave status passed to descendants, creating hereditary servile classes. Slaves performed labor and served as wealth objects. Their numbers varied by region, but could constitute significant proportions of populations. The presence of slavery fundamentally shaped social organization and economic production. Social stratification reached maximum elaboration. Clear distinctions existed between nobles, commoners, and slaves. Nobles controlled resources and political authority. They lived in larger houses and possessed prestige goods. Commoners formed the productive workforce. Slaves occupied the lowest status. This stratification appeared most developed in northern coastal areas. Artistic production flourished during late prehistory. Distinctive regional art styles developed. Carved wood, stone sculpture, and decorated objects displayed complex iconography. Artists depicted animals, mythological beings, and abstract designs. Art served multiple functions, including status display, ceremonial use, and storytelling. The sophistication of late prehistoric art demonstrates advanced aesthetic traditions. Ceremonial complexity increased as indicated by specialized artifacts and structures. Masks, rattles, and other ceremonial objects appear in archaeological contexts. These items functioned in rituals and performances. Ceremonial structures at some sites contained features suggesting specialized uses. The archaeological signatures of ceremony remain limited given poor preservation of organic materials. However, available evidence indicates elaborate ceremonial traditions. The late prehistoric period represents the culmination of cultural developments spanning millennia. Population growth, resource intensification, technological sophistication, social hierarchy, and artistic achievement characterized this interval. Regional variation persisted with different areas showing distinctive patterns. However, shared elements including salmon dependence, plank house architecture, and social stratification united the coastal culture area. The societies documented ethnographically at contact had deep prehistoric roots visible in the archaeological record. European exploration of the Pacific Northwest coast began in the 16th century but intensified during the 18th century. Spanish expeditions explored the outer coast from southern bases. Russian fur traders approached from Alaska. British expeditions surveyed coastal regions. These initial contacts remained sporadic and brief. Sustained interaction began only in the late 18th century. The period between initial contact and establishment of permanent European settlements witnessed profound demographic and social disruption. Population estimates at contact vary depending on methodology and region. Reconstructions based on ethnographic accounts, early explorer observations, and archaeological data suggest total populations between 100,000 and 300,000 individuals. The wide range reflects uncertainty in estimation methods. Different researchers apply different assumptions about household sizes, settlement densities, and regional coverage. Most estimates cluster around 150,000 to 200,000 for the entire coast from northern California to southeastern Alaska. Local population densities reached exceptional levels in favored locations. The Fraser River Delta supported particularly dense populations. Puget Sound contained numerous large villages. The Columbia River mouth area housed substantial communities. Northern coastal groups in the Queen Charlotte Islands and adjacent mainland achieved high densities. These concentrations reflected abundant local resources and long histories of intensive exploitation. Disease introduction constituted the most devastating impact of European contact. Indigenous populations lacked immunity to Old World diseases. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other infectious diseases spread rapidly through coastal populations. Epidemics occurred in waves beginning in the late 18th century. Mortality rates reached catastrophic levels. Some estimates suggest population declines of 80 to 90% within the first century of sustained contact. The first documented smallpox epidemic reached the coast in the 1770s. This outbreak preceded direct European contact in many areas. Disease spread through indigenous trade networks. Accounts describe wholesale village abandonment and mass deaths. The demographic impact fundamentally altered social organization. Leadership structures collapsed. Ceremonial knowledge died with practitioners. Social networks fragmented. Subsequent epidemic waves struck throughout the 19th century. Each outbreak caused additional mortality. Populations already reduced by previous epidemics suffered compounded losses. The cumulative effect devastated coastal societies. By the late 19th century, indigenous populations reached historic lows. Some groups disappeared entirely through death and assimilation. Others merged with neighboring populations. Social disruption accompanied demographic collapse. Traditional leadership depended on hereditary succession and demonstrated capability. Epidemic mortality disrupted succession lines. Knowledge holders died before transmitting specialized information. Ceremonial systems requiring specific participants could not function. The social fabric of communities deteriorated as populations declined and dispersed. Economic patterns shifted in response to European contact. The maritime fur trade created new economic opportunities and pressures. Sea otter pelts commanded high prices in Asian markets. European and American traders exchanged manufactured goods for furs. Indigenous groups participated actively in the trade. Some groups specialized in collecting and trading furs. The fur trade stimulated intensified hunting and intergroup competition. Introduction of European trade goods altered material culture rapidly. Metal tools replaced stone implements. Iron and steel proved superior for woodworking and other tasks. Cloth supplemented traditional fiber clothing. Glass beads became valued ornaments. Firearms transformed hunting and warfare. The adoption of European materials occurred quickly in areas with regular trade contact. Traditional technologies declined as manufactured goods became available. Stone tool production essentially ceased within decades of sustained contact. Knowledge of traditional manufacturing techniques eroded. Younger generations learned to use metal tools rather than stone. This technological replacement occurred rapidly but unevenly across regions. Remote areas maintained traditional technologies longer than locations with frequent trade access. Settlement patterns changed in response to new economic opportunities and threats. Some groups relocated to positions advantageous for trading. Others moved to avoid conflict or disease. Traditional village locations sometimes abandoned. New settlements developed near trading posts and missions. The spatial reorganization of populations disrupted traditional territorial patterns and resource access. Missionary activity began in the 19th century. Catholic and Protestant missions established stations in coastal areas. Missionaries attempted to suppress traditional cultural practices. Ceremonial activities faced prohibition. Traditional beliefs came under attack. Children were removed for mission schooling. The assault on traditional culture compounded demographic and economic disruptions. Colonial administration imposed new political structures. Treaties extinguished native title to lands in some areas. Reserves confined populations to limited territories. Traditional governance systems faced displacement by colonial authorities. Indigenous political autonomy eroded progressively. By the late 19th century, coastal groups existed under external administrative control. Archaeological evidence for the contact period consists of mixed indigenous and European materials. Sites contain both traditional artifacts and introduced goods. The stratigraphic contexts preserve the transition from pre-contact to contact period material culture. Glass beads, metal fragments, and other European items appear suddenly in otherwise traditional assemblages. The archaeological signature documents rapid cultural change. Some traditional practices persisted despite disruptions. Salmon fishing continued as central economic activity. Plank house construction persisted in some areas. Certain ceremonial practices survived suppression attempts. Artistic traditions adapted to incorporate new materials and markets. The resilience of cultural elements demonstrates continuity despite catastrophic changes. Population recovery began only in the 20th century. Indigenous populations gradually increased from historic lows. This recovery occurred unevenly across groups and regions. Some populations rebounded more successfully than others. Contemporary coastal indigenous populations number in the tens of thousands. These populations represent only a fraction of pre-contact levels. The archaeological record of Pacific Northwest Coast prehistory provides evidence for complex developmental trajectories. Initial occupation occurred by at least 10,000 years ago. Early populations adapted to coastal environments through marine resource exploitation. Settlement patterns evolved from high mobility toward sedentism. Population levels increased over millennia. Technological sophistication developed in multiple domains. Social complexity emerged in late prehistory. Regional variation characterized adaptations across diverse environments. Material evidence preserves only partial records of prehistoric life. Organic technologies rarely survive archaeologically. Social practices leave ambiguous material signatures. Ideological systems cannot be reconstructed reliably from artifacts alone. The archaeological record provides frameworks for understanding subsistence, settlement, technology, and social organization. However, many aspects of prehistoric coastal cultures remain poorly understood or entirely unknown. Understanding Pacific Northwest Coast prehistory requires integrating multiple evidence sources. Archaeological excavations provide material data. Environmental reconstructions establish resource contexts. Oral traditions preserve historical information. Ethnographic accounts document practices at contact. Linguistic evidence indicates population relationships. Combining these sources creates richer understandings than any single approach permits. The prehistoric occupation of the Pacific Northwest Coast demonstrates successful long-term adaptation to marine-focused economies. Groups developed sustainable exploitation strategies for diverse resources. They created sophisticated technologies using available materials. They organized socially to coordinate labor and distribute resources. They elaborated cultural traditions expressed through art and ceremony. The archaeological evidence documents these achievements across thousands of years. Contact period disruptions ended prehistoric patterns abruptly. Disease, economic transformation, and political subjugation fundamentally altered indigenous societies. The continuities between prehistoric and contemporary coastal cultures exist despite catastrophic interventions. Archaeological evidence contributes to understanding these continuities and the depth of coastal indigenous histories. The material record spans from initial occupation through contact, preserving evidence of human adaptation, innovation, and resilience across changing environmental and social circumstances.